Well, as of the time of this posting of this discussion, we are just a few days away from the 170th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. It was held July 19th and 20th in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And many of you already know an awful lot about it, and so I won't repeat an awful lot. What I want to do is I want to highlight the document that we know of as the Declaration of Sentiments and the resolutions and that sort of thing. You can get into all the report and all of that sort of stuff. There's just been tons of things written about the history of it and the major personalities. Of course, down at the bottom left of your screen, Lucretia Mott, and at the bottom right of your screen, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Both of these two women were really the spearheads of the event, and very close working relationship and friendship much of their lives. Stanton was a terrific writer, and Mott was a terrific speaker, and so they made a great pair, and they together for decades championed women's rights. The important thing that I think to remember is that the abolition movement and the women's rights movement were movements that were, yoked, if you will, through much of the early part of the 19th century. And a number of scholars have talked about this. We don't have to go into too much detail about it, but the fact of the matter is that the Civil War did something very important, very momentous, very good in leading to the end of slavery. But because the two movements were so connected in many ways, the same people who were advocating for the rights of women were advocating for the abolition of slavery in most cases. Maybe they didn't see eye to eye on every aspect of it, but they certainly were. Those two social reform movements were very intricately linked. Once slavery was at least de jure abolished, first with the Emancipation Proclamation, second with the ending of the Civil War, and thirdly through amendments to the Constitution. Sadly, the fight for women's rights seems to, in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, taken a back seat. The idea was, well, that we accomplished something terrific here, and because the two movements were connected, once slavery had been abolished, in a way, women's rights and especially suffrage sort of lost some momentum in that regard. And in point of fact, only one individual, just one, who signed the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls, lived to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. That's because she was 18 years of age, or maybe 19 at the time. She was probably one of the younger people who signed it. Her name was Charlotte Woodward Pierce, and she lived to see it. All the other women who signed it did not live to see as they put it, the elective franchise granted to women through the 19th Amendment. It's kind of a sad situation. It took 72 years for the 19th Amendment to be ratified. Just want to focus a little bit on some of the major aspects of the text here. First of all, it's very obvious if you read it that it's modeled in spirit and language on the Declaration of Independence. Very, very much so. Consciously so. If you read the Declaration of Independence, and almost no one does anymore, it's a sad thing, it's essentially a polemic. It's an argument. It is also a letter of sorts, a missive sent to Parliament, it's got several audiences. First of all, it's supposedly submitted to the world opinion, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people, et cetera, et cetera. And so what it says is, we're submitting this to humanity. Our cause is a just cause, and humanity will be our judge of it. So it's sent to King George. Obviously, it's supposed to go to him and say, look, this is our beef with you. It's sent to Parliament partly because it's looking for sympathy from some, and it's looking to criticize others in Parliament. They wanted friends. They did, and they were making their case. They also wanted allies. They wanted the French and others to endorse the the cause of independence. And they were sending it to people domestically, trying to make the case to the people living in the colonies at the time that this was a good cause, it was a just cause, we were in the right, etc., etc. So it had multiple audiences. It makes it an interesting document. This, too, because it's kind of framed that way, has multiple audiences. Most of them domestic, for sure. I'm not sure how effective rhetorically it is that it sort of glommed onto or mimicked the language of the Declaration of Independence, but in one respect, certainly rhetorically, it is powerful, and that is that everyone at that time would have known the language of the Declaration of Independence, and they're trying to link their cause to the cause of independence. So therefore, in a way, it casts them in a light of being more patriotic, that this is an American thing to be for, right? We're doing what our forefathers and foremothers wanted to do with respect to independence. We're trying to see the dream through to full fruition. And so by adopting the language and the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, it certainly makes the people who signed it seem more patriotic. Where I have a little bit of a beef in its rhetorical effectiveness is that if you read Jefferson's document, it's very clear that King George and some members of Parliament in the UK are the opponent. They are the foe. They are the adversary. By adopting the language of the Declaration of Independence and making the foe or adversary men, and it states it quite clearly that that's the case, I think it loses something there. But that's my personal opinion. Again, this is commentary. In other words, this rhetorical strategy had advantages and it had some disadvantages. Because if you adopt Jefferson's language about the king and frame it in terms of men have, you lose a little bit there because you run the risk of alienating. Even Jefferson pulled back when he criticized Parliament because he knew he'd better not alienate all members of Parliament, because there might be some members of Parliament back in London who were actually good friends or potential friends for the Americans. So, you make of it what you will. I think it's an interesting approach, and I think it's certainly a historic document. I want to focus on, by the way, a couple of things that you need to know is that the call for voting rights, right, elective franchise, was one of the two things that was the greatest were the greatest points of contention at the convention. It was not a kumbaya thing by any means. These women got together. They had very different opinions. They were different individuals with different motivations, and they were very passionate in different regards. So it's not some sort of monolithic block. This was a diverse group of women for that time anyway. And of course, everybody makes a big deal of the fact that Frederick Douglass attended. Of course he did, and was a contributor and participant. But it's notable that of the two women who spearheaded this, Lucretia Mott did not actually want for the convention to push for women's right to vote. She had her own, and you can go take a look at some of Mott's biographies on Mott. She didn't think it was a good idea to do that at that point. Some scholars say, well, her reasons for doing that, she didn't want to push too hard on that at this point. But others there prevailed and said, no, we're going to put that in there, that women should have the right to vote. The other thing that was kind of a contentious thing, or at least there was some vigorous debate as to whether men should be signatories on the document. Should this be a document that's only signed by women, or should men be signing it as well? Well, that's an interesting debate, I think. I don't know. What do you think? Part of me says this is a women's rights issue. This is an opportunity and a platform for women to be heard. To have men involved in it waters it down in some regard. On the other hand, if what you're doing is using the Declaration of Independence and to sort of bounce this off of as a sounding board and adopting that spirit and language, one of the criticisms of the Declaration of Independence is that there were only men, right? And what if your point is that the Declaration of Independence was something that started a movement that should see its way through to extending the blessings of liberty to both men and women, then it was a flaw in the Declaration of Independence that there weren't both genders being signatories. So to exclude men from it would be hypocritical? I don't know. There are great arguments for both sides, but I think it's an interesting question. I would have liked to have been there, I think, to hear the arguments both sides. I don't know how I would feel about it. Of course, I'm a guy, so, I don't know. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I feel that men should have had the right to be signatories on it. It would have just been an interesting debate in my mind. I want to take a look at some of the key resolutions in the Declaration. We won't go through it just word for word here, but it is important to take a look at it. That it begins sort of with the great precept, whereas the great precept of nature is conceded to be that man shall pursue his own true and substantial happiness. You heard what I said in the last part, or the part one of this, about happiness, that was, of course, from Jefferson, derived from John Locke's second treatise of government. John Locke's actual wording was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Jefferson changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for a couple of reasons. One, the word property was a loaded term, frankly, and at that time could mean human property, right? But more importantly, I think Jefferson broadens that and says, well, it's not so much property that people want in life, it's happiness, fulfillment. And of course, they begin with that and say, look, that is the premise upon which, natural law, natural rights are based. And if that's the case, then all human beings are entitled to pursue happiness, not just men, okay? Resolved that such laws as conflict in any way with the true and substantial happiness of woman are contrary to the great precept of nature and of no validity. That's a very aggressive thing. Any law that contradicts the natural law, because written law, right, codified law, originates from the great broad natural law that precedes it, right? So there's this underlying natural law that exists. Of course, this is all social contract theory and all that kind of stuff. Natural law comes first, and we base all of our just and written laws on natural law. It can't conflict with natural law. And so it's always been held that any law that runs counter to natural law is not a valid law, and so this is a very aggressive step to say that if a law denies women their natural rights, then it's not a valid law, and they're entitled to break that law. That's the implication, of course. An invalid law is not a law. It doesn't need to be obeyed. That's really aggressive when you look at the wording of that. Of course, that's the basis of the revolution itself, and that's what Jefferson says. Look, a regime that denies its citizens the basic rights under natural law is not a regime that needs to be obeyed. Resolved that all laws which prevent women from occupying such a station in society as her conscience shall dictate are contrary to the great precept of nature, that women have a right to ascend to the level of their talents and their abilities and occupy a station that's fitting to those talents and abilities. Resolved that woman is man's equal. Well, that one right there would I don't know what percentage of the male population would have said, well, that's ridiculous. But no doubt it was. But they didn't flinch. They were going to assert this, and consequences be darned with respect to popular opinion. Others resolved it is preeminently his duty to encourage her to speak, teach, as she has an opportunity in all religious assemblies. This is a real, believe it or not, that we focus on the political, the religious implications of this, or the implications with respect to religious practice and belief, would have been probably one of the most contentious aspects of it. The idea that women should be able to speak and hold positions within churches that are equal to men would have run afoul of an enormous number of people, both men and women, honestly. I can recall my mother definitely believed that women should not preach. Women should not be preachers or ministers. That the Apostle Paul dictated that women should be silent in church, and she did not go for women preachers. She was fairly conservative in that regard. People feel differently sometimes today. Some people do, some people don't. But you can imagine if it was a contentious thing today, it must have been a tremendously contentious thing then. If there are women today who don't agree with that, there would have been many, many women who didn't agree with that then. Resolved that the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of woman in the social state should be required of man, and the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. Read double standard, right? And that was the case even back then. I mean, when you look at all kinds of things in terms of, drinking and gambling and, sexual promiscuity. What they're saying is, don't hold women to a more severe standard than you hold men. Actually, they're not actually saying, well, we want to be able to go out and get drunk and sleep around too. No, they weren't saying that. But they certainly were saying, look, we can't have two standards of moral behavior, because having two standards of moral behavior means that there's no moral advancement within the society. Resolved that the objection of indelicacy and impropriety, which is so often brought against woman when she addresses a public audience, right? It's not appropriate that women should speak in the legislature, or speak in the pulpit, or speak in the public square, comes with a very ill grace from those who encourage by their attendance her appearance on the stage, in the concert, or in the feats of the circus. In other words, you're perfectly happy to have women, get up there on stage, or do can-can dances, or dress in skimpy outfits at the circus, but you don't think it's appropriate for women to speak in the public square. Essentially, you're fine making us into objects, but you're not okay with us speaking our minds. And you have to understand how scandalous most people thought actresses and female circus performers and singers and vaudevillians were. It's no exaggeration to say that a lot of middle class and conservative people in the 19th century would have seen actresses as very little more than prostitutes. And so what they're saying is, it's perfectly fine to have women speak on stage for your amusement and entertainment, but you certainly don't want to listen to their ideas in a legislature. Resolved that women has too long rested satisfied in the circumscribed limits which corrupt customs and a perverted application of the scriptures have marked out for her. Here they're really crossing over from the political to the theological, that they're saying that the very foundation, the religious foundation of the traditional role of women needs to be challenged because it involves a perverted application of scripture. You can only imagine how many conservative religious figures would have said, this is just akin to blasphemy. These women are speaking about something that they have no knowledge of. They're speaking out of turn. They have no right to go around telling us how to interpret scripture and so on and so forth. Just a really, really big and you can see that the religious element here is inseparable from the political one. The religious and moral and spiritual element is inseparable from the political here. That was true with the abolition movement. We're going to see that when we get into some other texts in a bit. It goes on, of course, after the resolutions of the convention. It goes on in the Declaration to say, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. That, I think, is a really interesting thing. Again, I can only imagine that it probably alienated about as many people as it inspired. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. Here, the taxation without representation comes up here, having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation. He has made her, if married in the eye of law, civilly dead. Right? She's just practically a dead person once she gets married. He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments. He's taken all the jobs. She has no opportunity to go and fulfill her talents and abilities through the workplace. He has denied her the facilities of obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. In church, exclusion from any public participation in the affairs of the church. You have to understand that we look at these women and say, oh, pioneers. These women would have been looked at by a significant segment of the population as not just radical, but plain crazy and ungodly. That is no exaggeration to say that. There would have been people who dismissed them and said, these people are kooks. They would have been dismissed as being radicals and revolutionaries, as being women who were trying to destroy the American family and the American way of life. There would have been people who simply wouldn't have even argued about this with them, thinking that they had lost their minds. Especially when they delved into the realm of religion. And these are women who are not trained theologians, and yet they deign to take on the position that they're going to tell us how to run the churches. They would have been seen as women who were basically defying God. My point here is in the little time that I have is to say this is a very famous document, a very famous event, a very famous set of texts. And they're worthy of deeper consideration than just what sometimes people do, which is say, hooray, how progressive, etc. I think they deserve to be looked at and scrutinized and said, these are really, really significant ideas that would have brought an enormous amount of animus on the part of many people in the society, and ridicule among others. And yet we hold it up and say, oh yeah, this is just, we kind of sell it short by treating it as though this is just one of these great first mile markers on the way to progress, when in fact, yeah, but gosh, this would have been very difficult to deal with if you were one of the women who attended this convention. I mean, you had to have had an enormous amount of backbone and be willing to suffer the blows of public opinion to have held these kinds of sentiments. I can only imagine that this would have made people feel somewhat isolated. As far as Margaret Fuller is concerned, at the time, Margaret Fuller was not at that convention because she was living in Italy with Count Ossoli, having just, I think, within a few months given birth to their child. Sadly, Margaret Fuller, on her way back in 1850, died in a shipwreck off of Fire Island in New York, and her husband/lover, we don't really know whether they were legally married, doesn't really matter, I guess, but they were a family with their 2-year-old son. They drowned, and she never did make it back, but there's every reason to believe that she was a huge backer of this. Her correspondence indicates that she was excited about it and glad to see it happen, but it was an important first step for women's rights in the United States, a formal first step, but we don't want to say that it was heralded as this great, wonderful event by the general public. It would not have been. Important as it was, it probably would not have been seen as this, oh, wow, gosh, why didn't we do this long ago? No, these women caught a heck of a lot of flack for it, there's no question about it, and would have been roundly criticized, if not ridiculed. All right, so I encourage you to look at the text very closely and contribute to our discussion, whatever you would like, and we will continue on with our next set of readings for next week.